So our sugya for today, Bezrat Hashem, is on Daf Nun Zayin, which is actually today's daf. Usually, I try to do a daf in the past, but in this case, because this sugya that appears on Daf Nun Zayin is so fundamental, it's a shas sugya. It appears all over the place. Therefore, I thought, in honor of today's Daf Yomi, we could do Daf Nun Zayin. And this is the beginning of the 8th parak called Shnei Nazirim. And a person tells these two Nazirim that one of them, I saw, became Tumah. But Eini Yodea Eza Mikhem. Now, later on, the Gemara is going to be daik that it doesn't say that he forgot which of them became Tumah, but he apparently never knew which of the two became Tumah, which is very strange. In any event, the Mishnah establishes that since one of them for sure became Tumah, we don't know which one, they both are in a Safek Tumah. And as a result of that Safek Tumah, each one is going to need a double giluach, meaning a giluach at the end of that Tumah process, assuming that you're Tameh on that side. And then they're going to have to start counting a full Nazirus of Tara, a 30-day Nazirus of Tara, and at the end of which they'll need another giluach. So that means each one will need two giluachs. The Gemara later on is going to discuss how can you have a giluach be Safek when a giluach, by removing the hairs from the pas harosh, is a violation of al takif. Okay, that's not for us today. But be that as it may, the Mishnah solves this problem as far as karbanos. So again, to require giluach over and over again, a second giluach because maybe he was tummy, that's fine. That's not a problem. However, what about the karbanos? So the Mishnah goes ahead in great detail and solves the problem of karbanos with a kind of shutfis al t'nai, in which case each one says to the other one, look, if I'm tamei, then this carbon should be carbon tumah. And if you're tamei, then this will be your carbon tumah. And any event, without going into all the details, they work it out. The bottom line for our purposes today is that we have a case of Safek tumah, and we're going to apply the dinim of Safek. All the dinim of Safek will apply if one of the two Nazirim, and we don't know which one, is Tameh. And this is based on the principle called Safek Tumah B'Rshus HaYachid Sfeiko Tameh, which is a principle derived from the Parsha of Sota. The Torah says in the Parsha of Sota that after a woman had kini and stira, and she goes into a private place with that person that the Baal was makana from, then she's considered asura al baila unless she drinks from the meimarim and proves her innocence. But in the meantime, she's asura al baila, and we're going to apply the principle of Safek Tameh. And the Torah says v'nitma'a. That's the lashon of the pasuk. And from that word v'nitma'a, we're going to derive conclusions about Tumah, even though, again, we're talking about Eishes Ish, that's Isurei Erva, but we're going to derive from those Isurei Erva the halach of Tumah, that if you have a Safek Tumah, then Sfeiko Tameh, and there's going to be a din of Tumah. But again, that's only going to apply in a case of a Rishus HaYachid. And the reason for that is because there's only a Boel and a Niveles. They're in a Makom Seiser, and a man and a woman, or for that matter, two human beings that are in a Makom Seiser, that creates a Rishus HaYachid. The Gemara is going to be amazed at this Mishnah, because how could it be that we deal with that Mishnah as a Safek Tumah B'Rshus HaYachid, and therefore Mitame? There's a third person here. That third person was presumably together with the two Nazirim in one close proximity, and therefore that makes it into Rishus HaYachid. Into Rishus HaRab. And that's the difference between a Boel and a Veles in the case of Kinui and Stira, where there's two people and max two, that's called a Rishus HaYachid, as opposed to a third person in our Mishnah, which is a Rishus HaRabim. So again, it has nothing to do with the laws of Rishus HaRabim, Rishus HaYachid in Shabbos. No, if there's an aid, then there's no, she doesn't drink for the Meimarim. She only drinks for Meimarim because there was no aid at all. There were only two Eidim who saw from a distance that she violated the kinu, but there was no one inside the room. Right. Here we're talking about inside the room. So the Gemara is going to answer that our Mishnah is talking about a case of Ra'isi Tumah Shenizrika. In other words, this person who's testifying is at a distance. He was not together with the two Nazirim, and therefore the two Nazirim were alone, which makes it into Rishus HaYachid. And Rav Ashi is going to be medaik from the Mishnah. How could it be that the Mishnah says that he doesn't know which of the two became Tameh? And the answer is because the Tumah came from a distance. So therefore he wasn't there, afanart, as we say in Yiddish, on the spot, in order to know which of the two Nazirim became Tameh. So since he's out of the picture, so to speak, therefore we have Rishus HaYachid, and we're going to apply the principle of Sfeiko Tameh.
And the Nazirim don't know which one of them is Tameh?
They don't know. Believe it. Maybe it came from the back or something like that. Okay, then. So what we're going to study today, Be'ezer Hashem, is this principle that we derive from Sota of Safek Tum Rishus HaYachid Sfeiko Tameh, and Safek Tum Rishus HaRabim, if there was a third person there, which makes it into Rishus HaRabim, is Sfeiko Tameh. Now, this appears in a Mishnah in Masechet Taros, in the second parak, appears in Masechet Sota on Daf Chav Ches Amid Beis, in Nazir here on Daf Nun Zayin, and in Masechet Sota, the Gemara explains that we derive from Sota that since Sota is a case of a Bol and Eles in a Rishus HaYachid, meaning that only two people, and the Torah says that she's assumed to be Tmei until proven innocent, she's guilty until proven innocent, so too in Tumah, Sota is Rishus HaYachid, Mimakom Shebasa, and therefore in Tumah, if it was a situation of Rishus HaYachid, again, it's going to be Sfeiko Tameh. However, Sota, in the case of Rishus HaRabim, if let's say there was a third person who was in the room, not just the Baal and the Veles, then she would not be Asur al Baila, she's still Muteris al Baila, and we're going to apply the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim, Sfeiko Tahor. So that's clear from the Gemara in Masechta Sota. Our Gemara here in Nazir is going to vacillate as to whether or not the third person who's testifying is within the same room as the two Nazirim, and that would make it into Rishus HaRabim, and then we should apply the principle of Sfeiko Tahor. They would not bring any Karbanos of Tumah because there's no Safek Tumah, as opposed to a situation where that third person is at a distance, he's not together with the two Nazirim, and therefore it's a Rishus HaYachid, and we're going to apply the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid Smeiko Tameh. Now we have to understand the following question. We're saying that if there are three people, it's considered Rishus HaRabim, and that we're going to derive from Sota. So it seems that the gather of Sota is not just to tell me that in Safek we're going to be Machmir and so forth, but it's also going to define what is Rishus HaRabim and what constitutes a Rishus HaYachid. That we're going to derive from Sota. You and I might have said, well, it depends whether it's seeable to the public, it's out in a public place, everyone has access, or it's a private place, which is locked. No. None of those definitions will operate with regard to Safek Tum Rishus HaRabim, Safek Tum Rishus HaYachid, but rather we're going to derive from Sota that it depends not on where the place is, but on how many people were there at the time of the action. But now the question arises, why do we need a derivation from Sota that Safek Tum Rishus HaRabim Sfeiko Tahor? We have halacha in Kol Torah Kula called Chazaka. Uki Gavra Aches Kaseh. In the case of a Safek Tumah, the Gavra presumably had a Cheskas Tahara, and therefore, in the case of Rishus HaRabim, you want to derive from Sota that Safek Tum Rishus HaYachid. We do not apply the principle of Azlin and Basar Chazaka. Fine, that I can accept. But to go a step further and say that from Sota, we're going to derive the conclusion that Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim is Sfeiko Tahor, Dal mi hachi, typically mishum cheskes tahara, unless we might suggest that perhaps we only need the derivation from Sota for Rishus HaYachid. As far as Rishus HaRabim is concerned, we'll apply the principle of cheskes tahara. Or alternatively, it could be that the derivation from Sota, as far as Safek Tum Rishus HaRabim, is a very important derivation in a case where there is no Cheskes Tara. Like, let's say, for example, you have a situation where two people were close to Maga of a Sheretz, then it could be that because of their proximity to the sheretz, although we're not sure which one of the two may have actually had contact with the sheretz, they forfeit their cheskes tara. Be as it may, again, I don't want to get off on a tangent, but in scenarios where there's no cheskes tara, would we still apply the principle of Safek tum b'shus harabim sfeikotar? And on the one hand, we might say, and this is the sheet of Tosfos here in Nazir, that the entire derivation from sota is limited to rishus hayachid. As far as rishus harabim is concerned, we don't need any derivation, and there never was the alfusa from sota regarding rishus harabim. The case of sota is rishus hayachid, and therefore rishus harabim we fall back on the general universal halachas of uki gavra cheskasei, and therefore we would be mitayr in rishus harabim in a Safek based on cheskes tara. But then you're implying that if there is no cheskes tara, then you don't have any derivation from sota, so therefore you would assume that Safek tamei, like any Safek toraisa l'chumra. That's one approach. The other approach is to say, no, we're going to derive something from sota, even as far as the principle of Safek tum b'shus harabim sfeikotar. Why do I need that? We have a universal halach of cheskes tara. The answer is for a scenario in which he doesn't have a cheskes tara. And if he doesn't have a cheskes tara, then what will we do in a case of Safek? And the answer is we're going to derive from sota that despite the fact that he has no cheskes tara, Rabbi, you hear this point, very important point. Even in the absence of a cheskes tara, we're going to be mitayr him in Safek because of the derivation from sota. So sota has two parts to it. One part, right, one side of the matbea, is that Safek Tumah b'Rishus HaYachid Sfeikotame. Therefore, she's Asur al Baila, based on the fact that it's Rishus HaYachid, and that stiro, in which it was only the bowl and the velas, that's a Rishus HaYachid, generates a din of Tumah. But we're going to also have another derivation from Sota, the flip side, the other side, Atzad Sheni Shalom Atbeya. And that's going to be that in a Safek Rishus HaRabim Sfeikotar. Elamai, you can ask the question, what do I need that for? Anyway, we would say Uki Gavra Cheskas Tara. And the answer is going to be, well, the Torah now through Sota is teaching me an unbelievable chiddush that Safek tum b'shus harabim sfeikotar by definition, with or without a cheskes tara, and even in the absence of a cheskes tara, will still apply the principle of sfeikotar in rishus harabim. Okay, this is just to give you a little bit of an introduction to the sugya that we want to study in Mirza Hashem today. Now, let's take a look at Tosfos here. Dibra Maschil bi Omer. And almost everything that we want to study today is really in this Tosfos. So I'm always hoping they have a Gemara Nazir with you. Right? The Gemara says that the third person who testifies that one of these two Nazirim was contaminated was outside of the proximity of the other two. And therefore it makes it into Rishus HaYachid. Hence we understand that there's a Safek Tumah, and a Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid is Sfeiko Tameh, which means that there's a Safek whether he's Tameh or not, and therefore he has to undergo the double Tiglachas and the Tanai of the Karbanos of Nazirim, and so forth and so on. Fact Tosfos, for Omed Mirach, who Omed Mirach, have a Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid. V'im Tomar, im Kain Yavi Kol Echad Karban Tumas Vada. Wait a second. What do we derive from Sota? A woman who had kidney and steer is Asura al Baila. We don't consider her to be in a state of Safek, but rather she's Vade Asura. And if he would have a relationship with her, or for that matter, the Boel would have a subsequent relationship with her, they violate an Isa Lavdo, right? So they'll get Malchus for that. So the parsha of Sota is teaching me that in Rishus HaYachid, Sfeiko Tameh b'Torah's Vaday. So Tosfos says the following: if you've already concluded that this person who's testifying is Meirachok, he's not there in close proximity, therefore you only have two people, these two Nazirim, which makes it into Rishus HaYachid, then why do they have to bring a Karban Tara? There's no Safek of Tara here, because Safek tu Rishus HaYachid, Sfeiko Tameh b'Torah's Vaday. And therefore you should only be bringing, or both of them, should only be bringing a Karban Tumah. The entire Mishnah, based on this Kash of Tosfos, is undermined, because if, as the Gemara insists, we're deriving Safek tum b'shus hayachid and applying it in this case from Sota, because here we only have two people, the two Nazirim, then they're both Tmeim. And if they're both Tmeim, it's not a case of Safek Tumah, whether he should bring all the karbanis, both of a karban Nazir Tameh and a karban Tameh. The Chol Safek Tusharam Sarfin Alet Truma. I'll prove to you that Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid is Tameh B'Torah's Vadai. And my father said this at his chuppah, right before they took him to the chuppah. That was his Dvar Torah. I'm talking about probably 80 years ago, not 100 years ago. My father was alive today, be 105. That's about 85 years ago. Anyway, he's very young when he got married. And at the shmog, before the chuppah, Reb Chaim Simon was there. My father's good, close buddy from childhood, and Chaim Simon started yelling at him, and he got up and stood. And then Reb Moshe, who was the Masada Kedushin, Reb Moshe Soloveitchik, he started yelling at Chaim Zimmerman, and my father had a tremendous headache because they were fighting back and forth, Reb Moshe against Reb Chaim Zimmerman, and finally, Reb Moshe looked at my father's face, he saw how white he was, he says, Lozim Endikin, let him finish his Torah, and we'll take him into the chuppah. So Reb Moshe saved my father. In any event, we see clearly that Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid Sfeiko Tameh B'Torah's Vada. So therefore, why is he a Safek Tameh if there are only two Nazirim in the room? No one else is there. It's a Rishus HaYachid. V'yesh Lamer D'lo Gemiri Misota, that we cannot derive the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid from Sota in this case of two Nazirim, one of which is Tameh. How is that radically different than Sota? In Sota, there's only one person.
It's a pure Safek.
And if we're going to say Tameh because of Safek, then fine, she's Tameh. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that she's Tameh. But in this case of Shnei Nazirim, what do we know?
And if one is Tameh, the other one is not Tameh.
Exactly, that the other one is not Tameh. He says, Lo Gemirim Sota, Elidover She'efsho Lios Kisota. If it's possible that like a Sota, you could say Tumas Vadai, then that's what we're going to derive from Sota. The efsha shenitmes. Aval hacha lo efsha litamos et shneim. You can't be mitami both of them and apply the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid Sfeiko Tameh to each one of the two Nazirim. To vadei echad tar. To the same extent that we know that one of them is Tameh, we know that one of them is tar. So we're not going to derive it from Sota. Okay, so we don't derive it from Sota. So what do? L'chora, what we should do is we should apply the universal principle of Uki Gavra B'Chezkas Tara. Each one of the two Nazirim has a Chezkas Tara until proven guilty, and therefore they should both be Tahorim. And this is just the opposite of the Gemara. The Gemara is saying that we're going to apply the principle of Safek Tameh, and therefore it's a Safek for each Nazir, whether he's Tameh or Tahar. And we should l'chora, without the derivation from Sota, we should our fallback position should be Chezkas Tara. Tosfos asked the following question: V'im Tomer and Kain, my parich may kara v'safek tum b'shus rabbimu. The Gemara asks, if we assume that the third party, the aid, is together with them in the same proximity, so you have two Nazirim plus the third party, you now have three, and therefore it's a Rishus HaRabbim. And therefore the Gemara asks, why not apply the principle of Safek Tum Rishus HaRabbim Sfeikotar? Frektosis, I don't understand. We just established that the rules and regulations of Sota have no application here, because Sota is a case where you can say Vadai, she was Tmeah. That's theoretically possible. But in the case of Shnei Nazirim, when we know one of them is Tar, we cannot derive a clue from Sota. And if that be the case, why does the Gemara insist that if the third guy who saw the Tumah fall between the two of them was with them together, we should apply the principle derived from Sota that Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabbim Sfeiko Tar, and that was Gemara's problem over here, and that brought the Gemara to the conclusion we had no choice. We were compelled to assume that the third party was Mirachal. Why? How do you apply the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabbim in this case when it's Eina Dover Yachal Lios Emes? There's no way you could say that they are both Tahorim or both Tmeim. And he says the following: Vasafek Tumah Rishus HaRabbim Dimitarinon Nami Misota Gamrina Le. Tosfos is assuming. Remember, we had a suffix about this before. We were wavering back and forth whether, in the case of Rishus HaRabbim in a suffix, we need to derive tar from Sota, or we don't need that at all. It's completely superfluous and unnecessary because we have a universal principle. Uki Gabra Cheskaseh. Tosfos now assumes that the Hilchas HaGemiran from Sota is going to generate new dinim, not only in Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid, but even in Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim. Not maybe Sota Gamrin. So Tosas asked the following kasha. Okay, fine. You want to derive a new din of Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim Sfei Kotar from Sota, but you can't do it in this case because we know that one of them was certainly Tameh. And he says, therefore, Lo Yalfinan Ela B'Dover She'efshar Lios. But hachavade echatame, and therefore you cannot apply the principle of Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim Sfei Kotar or Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid Sfei Kotame from Sota. And if we can't derive from Sota, what underlies the Gemara's kasha when the Gemara says if the third guy is within close proximity of the other two Nazirim, then it's a situation of Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim, and we should derive from Sota that they're both Tahorim. How can we do that? It's Einach Haluka Yechol Lios Emes. It's impossible that both of them are Tahorim. Therefore, we cannot derive by equation by analogy anything to Sota. And what is the Gemara's kash? The Shlomar, the Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim, this you have to underline, Lav mi Sota Gamrina Le. Tosas now makes an about face, 180-degree turnaround. There's no need to derive Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim from Sota. No need for that. El kol chad v'chad mukminan aches kaseh. Each one he comes to the table with his own personal cheskes kashrus, cheskes tara. And therefore, we would apply the principle of Safek tar, irrelevant to Sota, without Sota. The Alfina le Mikra and the Gemara in Chulin on Daf Yud, the very famous sugya in Shas, asks, how do we know the Chazak? And the Gemara has derivations for the halach of Chazak lahamid kol davar cheskaseh. The afal gav devare echad tameh, kaven de lo yadinale. We don't know who is the tameh, so each one comes to the table waving his flag of what? Of cheskas tara, and we're going to be v'tar both of them. See, herein lies the difference between what we're going to derive from Sota as a unique halacha l'Moshe Sinai and the universal halacha without Sota of uki gavra cheskaseh. When we apply uki gavra cheskaseh, we apply it to the end degree, even when we get to a situation which is not emes. And this is Gemara Masechet Pesachim. I forget what daf. Maybe it's on daf Zayin. No, it's earlier than daf Zayin, where you have two people who went down two shvilim. We know there was a mess in one of the two shvilim, and we're going to be retire both of them. Again, there's another problem of chucha v'tlula if they both come to Bezdin simultaneously. But if each one comes to Bezdin separately, we'll apply uki gavra cheskas tara, even though it's not emes. We know that one of the two is tameh, and they're both going to be considered tahorim, and that's going to be the halacha without sota. I don't need sota for that.
Well, what's the alternative?
You mean what do we derive from sota? What is your question?
I mean, what would you do if you didn't say they were both tahorim?
Again, the case of Psachim is we're going to say they're both Tar. Right. And one of them definitely crossed over the Kevin.
What can you do?
So we're going to, L'chara, we should have said in such a case that you can't use Chazak here because Chazak is going to lead you to an impossible conclusion, untenable. You can't say they're both Tahorim.
And therefore?
And the Gemara says, no, we're going to derive from this parsha of Chazaka that Chazaka will apply even if it's Ef Shalios Emes. Even if we're going to be retired two people where we know full well, without a shadow of a doubt, that one of them came in contact with the Tumah. And therefore, Tosafos says that this would have been the situation without Sota. Now, Tosafos doesn't fill in the last piece of the puzzle. So what then do we derive from Sota? In the Havamina, Tosafos says that we would derive from Sota, Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim Sfei Kotar. But now in the Maskana, Tosafos says we don't need to implement the principle or derive the principle of Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim Sfei Kotar from Sota, because anyway, we'll apply the principle of Uki Gavra Cheskaseh.
Why do you need to learn anything from Sota?
So now Tosafos seems to us, well, no, we need to learn Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid. Because again, what would have been the universal principle? We would have said they're both tahorim, because each one comes to the table with his cheskes tara. So that's the gevaldige chiddush of the parsha of Sota, that even though she has a cheskes tara, nevertheless we're going to assume that she's tmeya because of stira, which means rishus hayachid, it's only a bol and a veles. And that's the chiddush in Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaYachid. But as far as Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim is concerned, I'm going to apply the principle, the universal principle of what? Uki Gavra, the Cheskes Tara, and I don't need Sota for that. So Sota is only Alfusa in one direction, not in both. Only as far as what? As far as Safek Tumah, Rishus Yachid, Sveikotam. But not as far as Safek Tumah, Rishus Rabim. There we're going to apply the universal principle of what? Al Cheskas Tara.
But not for Sota. Why are we even? I mean, back to Chaim's question. Why are we even learning anything? The same applies to Rishus Harabim and Rishus. They each have their chazaka.
But
what's
what's
different?
what's the chazaka? The chazaka is always Tara.
Right. So I'm saying, why are we learning Sota and applying it to Nazir?
Because again, without Sota, we would say they're both Tahorim.
I understand, but why do we need to apply Sota altogether? That's what I'm
He's saying,
asking.
why not say they're both?
In Rishus Hayachid, why are we even applying Sota?
Again, because in the case of Sota, she comes to the table of the Cheskes Tara, and yet the Torah says she's Tmeah. We're going to use that as a.
But that's only to her. We have to with Nazir, as we see, is different.
Oh, you mean because EF Shalios Emes?
Right. I'm saying is if we're going to apply in Rishus Harabim that they're both Tahor, why are we not applying it in Rishus Hayachid? Why are we even applying Sota?
Again, what Eli is asking is the following. If, according to Tosfos, we cannot derive any conclusions from Sota in the case where EF Shalios Emes, then once we mafkia the limud, the drasha, and the alfusa from Sota, then we should go back to the principle of chazakas, and even in Rishus Hayachid, we should apply the principle of Sveikotar.
Right.
Is that clear? That's your question.
That's right.
All right. So that's going to be the Shef Shvaita, which in Mitzvah we'll get to. But here I want to say the following. What do I want to say? Just 1 second. Okay, as I said before, Tosfos here in Nazir, in Yiddish we say he didn't fear us, meaning he left a little bit of a piece of the puzzle open. He didn't really finish the whole story. Why? Because even after I finish this Tosfos, and I assume that in Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim, I don't need a drasha, a yalfusa from Sota, because I would say tar anyway, because Uki Gavra Cheskas Tara. So what do we learn from Sota? Right? We know what we don't learn from Sota. Tosfos is outspoken that we don't learn from Sota, Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim, because we don't need Sota to be Matayr in that Safek because of Cheskas Tara. So what do we derive from this equation, shall I say, or analogy to Sota? So here we could say the following. Tosfos is saying that if there's a Cheskes Tara, then there's Tar without a Yalfusa from Sota. So now we come to the conclusion, perhaps, that what do we need the Yalfusa from Sota for, which again, as we said in the opening sentence, is all over the Shalo, all over Shas. It's coming to tell me that Safek Tumah B'Rishus Hayachid is Tameh. So far, so good? Okay. So that would mean that Safek Tumah B'Rishus Hayachid is Tameh, despite the Cheskes Tara, and that revolutionary Chiddush is derived from Sota. She has a Cheskes Tara, and yet the Torah considers her V'nitma'a. She's Asura L'Baila, Echel L'Bal, Echel L'Bol, etc., etc. So now we're assuming that the Halacha L'Moshe B'Sinai of Sota is teaching me what? Is teaching me Safek Tumah B'Rishus Hayachid Sveiko Tameh, and we do not apply the principle of Uki Gavra B'Cheskas. Again, Eli's pointing out that in this case of Shnei Nazirim, we cannot apply that, and we'll get back to that later on. However, what that would mean is that what's that noise? Oh, it's a phone. Okay, somebody left their phone here. Okay, they're probably calling their phone to try to find out where their phone is. Okay. In this essay, he comes up with a new possibility in Tosfos and Nazir, which I wanted to show you inside. So if you're looking at, 1 second, just find it. at page Ayin Tes. And you'll see that the first paragraph on Ayin Tes, which is the second page that you have, starts with the word Ha'olem Idivrei HaTosfos. And he says that on the second line, Tosfos holds that if there's a Cheskes Tara, we don't need the limud from Sota as far as Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim Sfeikotar, correct?
Right.
Ella Shadayin Yesh Lachar B'Shitas HaTosfos. This is what I said, there's a piece missing from the Tosfos, piece of the puzzle that's missing. What would be the din in Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim in the absence of Cheskes Tara? And he vacillates back and forth. I'm not sure who he's quoting here, so don't ask me that question. He says the following. Adayin yesh lachar b'shitas hatosfos. Again, this Tosfos in Nazir. Soon we'll take a look at Tosfos in Sota. But Tosfos in Nazir says, Ma yadin b'makom she'ein cheskes tara. Ha'im, okay, ha'im means possibility number one, right? You could add an aleph here. Kol din safek tumah b'shus harabim tar hu rak mikar cheskes tara. We don't have any derivation from Sota as far as Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim. Now, if you completely neutralize the Alfusa from Sota as far as B'Shus HaRabim is concerned, then what are you left with? Cheskes Tara. In the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we would have a Safek Tumah, 50-50. But now he adds O. Do you see that word O? After the word O, you want to add a base. This is the second side in his Chakira, which came to me as a total surprise. He says, Gam din Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim nilmad ba'halacha misota. He's raising the possibility that Lamaskanas HaTosfos, Sota is going to teach me not only Rishus HaYachid, but even Rishus HaRabim. How so? I mean, we just established that once we have the universal halacha to fall back on of Cheskes Tara, we don't need Sota. And he says the following, that perhaps what the Alfusa from Sota in the case of Rishus HaRabim is going to be that even in the absence of Chazaka, we're still going to apply the principle of Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim Sfeikotar. In the first side, we said the following. If we have no reason to derive anything, no need to derive anything from Sota, as far as Rishus HaRabim is concerned, and therefore the Alfus is only to be Mechadish Safek Tumah B'Shus HaYachid Sfeikotar, then basically as far as Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim, we fall back on the universal halacha, which would have been applicable before the Alfus from Sota, and then we would fall back on what? On Cheskes Tara. But in the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we'd be left with a pure Safek. Now he's offering another possibility, that although we don't need a derivation from Sota, according to Tosfos, in Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim when there is a chazaka, but nevertheless we need a derivation from Sota for Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim when there's no chazaka. And then we're going to come to the conclusion that we go through two stages, two different halachas. First, we try to apply the universal halacha of Cheskes Tara, and if that doesn't work, we have another position, and then we're going to apply the principle of Yalfida and Misota that Safek Tumah B'Shus HaRabim Sfeikotar even without a chazaka. That's his second possibility in Tosfos and Nazir.
I guess the obvious question is, what is the case of no chazaka? Like what?
Yeah.
We always, it's a universal. That's the
Right,
idea
so
of a
again,
universal principle. It's
that would require another shear, but let's just say that two people came in contact with the sheretz. Maybe we're not sure if the sheretz had a shear, or we're not sure if he touched that. Again, we know that there was maga, or for example, there's something called Safek Bia. Safek Bia means you don't even know if you went into the Sada. There was Tumah in the Sada. That would be Cheskes Tara. But let's say you know you went into the Sada, but you're not sure if you came in contact with a maga with the Tumah. Again, for this, we'd have to spend a lot more time than we have. But let's just accept it as a theoretical, shall we say, conceptual assumption that there are scenarios in which there's no Cheskes Tara, that we simply don't know. He has entered into a situation where he forfeited his Cheskes Tara, but we just have a Safek. And the question now is, what would be in that case in Rishus HaRabim? And it would be a tremendous nafkamina between our two interpretations of our Tosas and Nazir. Tosas and Nazir clearly, explicitly says that in a case of a Cheskes Tara, we don't need to derive anything from Sota and Rishus HaRabim because Uki Gavra Cheskes say. But Tosas doesn't add that extra piece to the puzzle and address the question, do we derive anything whatsoever from Sota as far as Rishus HaRabim is concerned? And there's quite a logical possibility he's claiming that yes, we do derive something from Sota in the case of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim. What are we going to derive? That he's tar even in the absence of what? Of a Cheskes Tara. So the first interpretation of Tosas and Nazir is that forget it. Tosas has now closed the door on any alfusa from Sota with regard to Rishus HaRabim. And we're simply going to fall back on the universal principle of Cheskes Tara. In the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we have a pure Safek. And now he's suggesting, no, maybe Tosas is only rejecting a alfusa from Sota vis-a-vis Rishus HaRabim in a case of a Cheskes Tara. But Tosas, even Lamaskanu, would agree that it's not totally superfluous to derive conclusions about Rishus HaRabim from Sota. Now we're opening up the possibility of a very radical, far-reaching conclusion that perhaps Tosas and Nazir would agree that in a case of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim in the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we would be mitayar him, despite the fact that there's no Cheskes Tara, and that's what we're going to derive from where? From Sota. That Sota is teaching me that in Rishus HaYachid, despite the Cheskes Tara, we're going to be mitamayim, and we said that Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid is Tomei V'Toras Vadai, whenever that halacha applies. And we're going to derive the flip side to the other extreme, from one pole extreme to the other in Rishus HaRabim. We're going to say, no, the Parsha of Sota is teaching me Tara. What do you mean teaching me Tara? I don't need a Parsha to teach me Tara. He has a Cheskes Tara. But the answer is, in the absence of a Cheskes Tara, the Parsha of Sota is going to teach me that Afal Pichen Sfeikotar. And if he has a doubt about Tosas and Nazir, he's going to try to prove that there are two other Tosas in Shas, one in Chulin and one in Nida, that certainly assume that even in the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we're still going to apply the din of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim Sfeikotar, and there's only one possible answer to the question: from whence would you derive such a conclusion? And what's the answer? It's got to be Sota, because applying the logic of Kol Yisuri Torah in the absence of a... How does Tosas prove this? Listen, Kara, I just want to get this in. I'm sorry, I'm all tzitzt about this. I can't begin to tell you how many hours I spent on it. The Gemara at the beginning of Masechet Nida, in the name of Reb Shimon, says the following. A man jumps into a mikveh, and we don't know if the mikveh became chaser. What happens is that with the passage of time, you have Arba and Sa in the mikveh, people go into the mikveh, they take out some of the water with them, and we're not sure if at the moment, we'll call it T1, when he jumped into the mikveh, it was still mole, it was still mitayar him. And Reb Shimon says that if it's a Rishus HaRabim case, okay, because there are other people around, whatever it is, then we're going to apply the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim Sfeikotar. Tosas, I don't get it. The man before he jumped into the mikveh was in what state? And he was a Tumah. He had a Cheskes Tumah. And yet, the Gemara itself, in the name of Reb Shimon, is applying the principle of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim Sfeikotar against the Cheskes Tumah. Take a look over here in the paragraph, and then Eli, I'll be right with you. Paragraph Dibra Maskil v'Tosas Chulin. You have such a paragraph? He quotes a Tosas in Chulin and a Tosas in Nida. That b'makom sheyesh chazaka, hareu tar machmas chazaka. Makom shein chazaka, yesh litar mikoach limud misota. Do you see that? Tosas in two places comes to the conclusion that we wanted to suggest as a second possibility in Tosas and Nazir, which means that even in the absence of a Cheskes Tara, we can still apply the principle derived from Sota of Safek Tumah Rishus HaRabim Sfeikotar in the absence of a Cheskes Tara. V'eino tzor chazaka. Even without a chazaka, we're going to apply the principle of Sfeik Tar, and he proves it from Rav Shimon. This I want you to see inside. It's if you have a printout, you should underline this. This is absolutely stunning. Rav Shimon says that you had a mikvah. Let's say it was in a public place. Again, public doesn't mean what you think it means, but it means that the people there at the time that he jumps into the mikvah, and they, after the Tumah jumped into the mikvah, maybe I shouldn't use the word jumped. I don't know. That's the way I always was brought up. But maybe that's not a nice word. After he dipped himself into the mikvah, correct myself.
After he was told.
After he was told. They checked the mikvah. What did they find? L'tzarenu, l'davonenu, they found that the mikvah is chaser. Says Reb Shimon, he's tar. Why? Because it's a rishus harabah.
How does that make a difference? What's the svara if there's people standing around or not standing around? Have the mitzias of whether
again, it's all exeris hakosov. None of this can be explained. It's halacha gmirle. The Gemara uses that term in many places. Halacha gmirle. Why should 3 people as opposed to 2 people make the difference?
Change the mitzvah. Right.
I mean, you could say they have a zimun, and you could ask in Hilchos Lashon Hara if something was said in front of 3 people about betlasa, it has a piercing to it. Again, there are many different.
That's different because that's relying on the gabra. Here, relying on the amount of water actually sitting in the mikvah doesn't change if there's 1 or 1,000 people watching.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's true always. You know, you don't know if he came in contact with a sheretz. You don't know if he came in contact with a mess. I mean, it doesn't change one iota whether 2 people there or 3 people there. But that's what we're deriving from Sota. Again, I'm sure there's a lot more to it, Ellie, than what I'm telling you now. But for our purposes, I really feel that that's an adequate answer to your question. So you follow this. He says, "V'lomed zos misota shafal pisha b'mikva ein lo leches afal pisha b'mikva ein lo leches achar cheskaso." You want to determine whether or not he was tar and the mikvah was mole at the time that he jumped in, at the time that he dipped in. You can't determine that based on chazaka because Adarabba, the mikvah has a chazaka. I'm sorry, the gavra has a chazaka of what? Of cheskes tumah. Adarabba, hame tameh. Al chizkaso. You're guilty until proven innocent. You're a tummy.
Doesn't the mikvah have a chazaka?
Okay. So that's the whole sugya in Nida. What do you do with what it's called a chazaka to be kara and a chazaka to hashta? I mean, for that you have to learn Pesach Pasuach in Masechet Ksubas Daf Tes, which is the most complicated sugya in Shas. In any event, what is Tosas and Nida pointing out over here? He's saying an unbelievable chiddush that what we derive from Sota are such far-reaching conclusions in both directions, whether it's Rishus Harabim L'Tumah or Rishus HaYachid L'Tumah, Rishus Harabim L'Tara, that we don't apply the dinim of Chazaka. So in Rishus Harabim, even though the Chazaka, the Gabra, that he's Tameh, we're going to be Matarim, says Reb Shimon. Why? Because it's in Rishus Harabim. And on the contrary, if it was Rishus HaYachid, even if he came in with a Cheskes Tara, we're going to be Metameh. So this is an unbelievable breakthrough. And again, could we push this into Tosin Nazir? Perhaps. Tosin Nazir only says that in the case of Chazaka, we don't need to derive anything from Sota as far as Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim is concerned. He has a Cheskes Tara. Well, what would be, as Tosas points out in 2 places, in Chulin and in Nida, if he has no Cheskes Tara, and in fact, maybe even on the contrary, he has a Cheskes Tumah, now we need the Alfusa, the mind-boggling radical Chiddush that we derive from Sota, that even though she has a Cheskes Tara, we're going to be Metameh her B'Shus HaYachid, and the flip side is going to be that even someone who has a Cheskes Tumah is going to be Safek Tar in a Rishus Harabim. All this is derived from the Parsha of Sota. Okay, this is complicated. Maybe I'll just say it b'kitzur, but don't ask me any questions here because we really, to appreciate the next couple of lines, we have to go through an entire sugya in Chulin with a shackle of Itaria. And the Gemara talks about a case where there's no Cheskes Tara, and the Gemara says, okay, there's no Cheskes Tara, but Hilchas HaGemirole Misota. Now, there was a Havamin in the Gemara, and there was a Maskana in the Gemara. In the Salkei Taitach of the Gemara says that despite the Cheskes Tara, we have a Hilchas HaGemirole Misota, Shaloya mokol edin chazak. In the Havamina of the Gemara, Tosas says, the Gemara didn't have a conclusion about minani mili. From whence do we derive the halach of chazak in kol Torah kula? We didn't know that. So therefore, even in the case of chazaka, we have a Safek. V'lo hoya din chazaka b'isurim. At this Havamina, until we have a derivation, there is no halacha of chazaka and isurim. Im kain b'ofen sheyesh lo chazaka. Dome la'ofen she'ein lo chazaka. There's absolutely no distinction, not a hair's breadth of difference between a case where he has a chazaka and a case where he doesn't have a chazaka. And therefore, we're going to derive from sota hilchasa gemir le misota, and that means that he's going to be Tomei aval b'maskana yesh din chazaka. But now that the maskana we differentiate between a case because we have a derivation of the absence of chazaka, as opposed to the case where he has a chazaka, then we're going to derive from sota that sveiko tome umachmas she'ein bo chazaka nitzrachim lahalachim yuchedes, and now we justify why we need a limud from a yalfus from sota, that even in the absence of chazaka we could still apply the principle derived from sota of Safek tum b'shus harabim sveiko Torah. In the next paragraph, he tries to prove from Rashi in Masechet Nida at the beginning of the Masechta that in a case where there was a Safek whether he actually touched the Tumah or didn't touch the Tumah, Rashi is going to apply the principle of Safek tum b'shus harabim sveiko Torah even in the absence of a cheskes tar. So let's just summarize where we're up to at this point. We have a Tosas in Nazir who points out that if there's a cheskes tara, then in Rishus Harab there's no need to derive anything from what? From Sota, because Uki Gavra Cheskes say. We're not sure what Tosas would say in Nazir in the absence of a cheskes tara. Do we have a derivation from Sota that in Rishus Harabim, in a case where there's no chazaka, we're going to be matayer only as a result of this special, unique halacha of hilchas hagemir le misota? And indeed, if in Tosas here in Nazir he left out that piece of the puzzle, we have two Tosasim that go on record explicitly that even in the absence of a cheskes tara in Rishus Harab will be mitayer. And not only that, Tosas even goes a step further. Even in the existence of a cheskas tumah, we're still going to say in Rishus Harabim sveiko tar, which can only be derived, obviously, from the yalfusa from sota, and therefore Tosas is going to claim that we derive two things from sota. Number one, Safek tum b'shus hayachid, even though he has a cheskes tara, he's tamei, and Safek tum b'shus harabim, even in the absence of what? Of a cheskes tara, and even in the case of a cheskes tuma, is sfeiko tor. Do any of these dina make any sense? Eli is asking. I would have to submit to you. The answer is no, especially in the light of what we're saying. It depends whether two people there or three people. And now we get to Tosas and Sota. So this is a mifneh, as we would call it. This is a turning point in our learning because we're now going to study Tosas in Masechet Sota. Tosas says the following. In Safek Tumah b'Rishus Harabim, if not for Gzeras HaKosev of Sota, we would have said that he's Tamei in Rishus Harabim, even if he has a Cheskes Tara. This is the most extreme possibility that we've had today. That in the absence of the Alfusa from Sota, until now we've been saying that in the absence of the Alfusa from Sota, we would have said Cheskes Tara, therefore he's certainly Tar. Now he's saying that even if there's a Cheskes Tara, he's going to be Tamei in Rishus Harabim, if not for the Alfusa from Sota. And how is that possible? V'rak mishum shalamedim misota, Tosas says, that's going to teach us that we could be metayr him in a Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim. If not for what? If not for the Alfusa from Sota regarding Rishus Harabim, that's the second side of the coin, we would have assumed that in Rishus Harabim, even in a case of Cheskes Tar, misveiko is tame. Ubiru. Well, what does that mean? Right? L'chora it's mirabsen nigra. He says shatam shalalo limud misota ein litabrish sarabim. And he says the following, because one thing is beyond question, that we do see in Sota that the Torah says that in Rishus HaYachid, the Bola and the Neveles, she has a din of Tumah b'Toras Vadai, and therefore she's Asura Echad L'Bal Echad L'Bon. He says the following, Hayinu Omrim, if not for a second side of this Yalfusa, Shabi Sota, from Sota itself, we're going to derive the conclusion that there's a din of Safek Tameh in every Safek Tumah. Sota is not telling me something about Rishus HaRabim versus Rishus HaYachid. But in the Havamina, if we didn't have the second side of the Alfusa, namely vis-a-vis Rishus HaRabim, we'd assume that what we're going to derive from Sota has nothing to do with a distinction between Rishus HaYachid and Rishus HaRabim. But rather, in the case of a Safek Tameh, we're always going to be Machriya L'tzad HaTumah. And that I see in the Parsha of Sota. Because we don't know if she had a bil or not, but we're going to assume she did. And why? Because that Safek is a Safek Tumah. And the Torah is Machmir and Safek Tumah way beyond whatever we would have imagined. And now we're going to apply that principle straight across the board, even in the case of Rishus HaRab. And Tosas says, L'kach ba halacha. Excuse me, now we need halacha derived from Sota, not only in the negative, in the case of Safek to Rishus HaYachid, but even in the flip side of Safek to Rishus HaRabim. Ulefi zeh l'shitosam, the last two lines on the right column, einanu mitarim b'Safek Rishus HaRabim ela rak b'makom sheyesh chazaka. Do you follow? We go from the Havamina to the Maskana. The Havamina went so far as to say that even in a case where she has a Cheskes Tara, she's Tmeya, because we're going to derive that from Sota. The Maskana is that, okay, you know what? If she has a Cheskes Tara, then we could be Mitayr her Rishus HaRabim. But we're not going to go to the other extreme and assume that in a case where she has no Cheskes Tara, and how much more so if she has a Cheskes Tumah, that we could be Mitayr and Rishus HaRabim. So if we look at the whole picture now, as it evolves, as it develops, we have on the one side of the equation Tosas in Chulin and in Nida, possibly even the Tosas here in Nazir, that in the case of Safek Tumah HaRabim, we're going to derive from Sota that we would attire you, even if what? Even if you don't have a Cheskes Tara. And the reason for that is because we never needed a Alfusa from Sota in Rishus HaRabim because of Cheskes Tara. So how do we justify the Alfusa from Sota, according to Tosas, in those two Masechtes, in Chulin and Nazir and Nida? It's going to have to be for a case where there's an absence of Cheskes Tara. Tosas in Masechta Sota comes from the opposite perspective. And he's assuming that if not for this Yalfusa of Safek Tumah B'Rishus HaRabim derived from Sota, we've concluded based on the Parsha of Sota that Safek Tumah is always Tameh, even despite the fact there's a Cheskes Tara. And now when you get to the Alfusa, is Eilucha Bohel Michidusha, we're going to minimize the Chidush. I'm going to say, no, we're going to derive the conclusion that Chazakas do operate in Safek Tumah, but only Rishus HaRabim. But if she doesn't have, or he doesn't have a Cheskes Tara, then we're going to say Sveiko Tom. Now, if you'll fast forward, we don't have that much time, to page Pei Beis, we're going to see a tremendous insight and a Shev Shmaitita into this sugya. Okay, the only thing is, I always get myself into this quandary. I never know, in what's it called, triage. I never know which part of this I should learn. But I'm going to be very selfish here for my own purpose, if you don't mind. But don't lose the place on, I don't know if you could do this in a phone, but how you could do this, so you have it printed out. Don't lose the place on pay bays. Okay, keep that open, but go back for a moment to one last paragraph that we have to add to our discussion in order to answer Ellie's question from before on page Ayin Tes. So we're back on Ayin Tes with another finger on pay bays. And we're on the left column, Huvali El. You have it? Okay. At this point, Huvali El, he goes back to Tosas in Nazir, who claims that we cannot derive, in the case of Shnei Nazirim, any conclusions whatsoever from Sota, because it's Ein Tumah Yechol Lios Emes, right? We can't say they're both Tahorim, like we would like to derive from Sota versus Rabin. We can't say they're both Tmeim, as we would derive if the third guy is far away and it's Rishus HaYochid, because it's not similar to Sota at all. And now, if you look on line 5, let's just count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ubetam achiluk, you have that? Ubetam achiluk kosu atosvis shachro l'tayr b'shusarab b'mokom sheish cheskes tara eina nilmedes misota ulekach mitarim. So, in a case where she has a cheskes tara, or in the case of Nazir who has a cheskes tara, we're not going to derive anything from Sota because the Torah says, as a universal principle, Uki Gavra Cheskaseh. Ulekach mitarin, afal pi she'en achro yichol lios emes. Do you remember we discussed this earlier? That the power of Chazaka is so far-reaching that we can apply Chazaka to two people and be mitar both of them, and we know for sure that one of them is Tameh. That we can't do from Sota. And therefore, if you skip down a few lines, ume'ato l'dasa tosvis b'sota, sha'af sofek tumah rishus harabim tar mishum she'alfina misota. Right, we saw that Tosfos in Sota deviates from the other Tosfos in Shas, and he's of the opinion that we must have a special derivation for Safek Tumah Rishus Harabim Tar from Sota, because otherwise we would have derived from Safek Tumah Rishus HaYachid that Safek Tumah Umitum, wherever it is always going to be Tameh. In Ken Yesh Ladun. Now we have a fascinating investigation according to Tosfos in Sota. What's going to be in a case where we cannot derive anything from Sota? For example, when you cannot have Achral Yichol Lios Emes. Can we apply the principle of Chazaka? Well, wait a second. Now, according to Tosfos in Sota, we should go back to the Havamina before the Alfusa from Sota, meaning the Alfusa of Safek Tumah B'Shus Harabim Sveiko Tar. What was the situation according to Tosfos in Sota before we had that analogy, that derivation? We would be Metame despite the Cheskes Tara. Now we have a situation of Efshal Lilmo Misota. Why? Because they can't both be Tameh, both be Tar. So what do? Should we go back to the Havamina? And we cannot derive Tar, V'lo nuchol etaro machmas chazaka. Do you hear what's going on, Rabbosai? Again, this could be against the Gemara Nazir. But what we're saying is if you have a Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim, but you cannot be Mitayr both of them, as we would have derived from Sota, because Sota is Yechol Lios Emes, and here it's Ein Yechol Lios Emes, so we don't have a derivation from Sota. Then we go back to the situation of Safek Tumah B'Rishus Harabim before the Alfus of Sota, and therefore, even if there's a Chazaka, we would have to be Matami both of these Nazirim, and that's against the Sugya here. Okay, that leads us to Pei Beis. How much time do we have? Maybe -1? All right. So again, I don't know if I'll have time to go through this, but I'm going to at least give you a homework assignment, as I always do at the end. I've yet to see anyone fulfill that request, but anyway. So on Pei Beis, if you take a look on the right column, you'll see a paragraph that starts Barishona. Okay, then? That paragraph is critical. The next paragraph, Ubitosvis, on the left column on Pei Beis is critical. And then you have the Shev Shmaitata, and then you have Omnam, and then you have Haderach. So basically, that's your homework assignment. I hope you enjoyed the shir. I enjoyed it immensely. If I could give myself a grade. My father, Zichron Lebracha, on every drasha that he wrote out, he would give himself a grade, which I only found out after he was nifta because I put together all his stuff. And the lowest grade he would ever give himself was Tov. That's the lowest grade. You know that if you wrote Tov, it's thumbs down. Sometimes he'd write Tov Ma'od or even Mitsuya.
Starting Arvei Tzachim on Rosh Chodesh, literally Thursday.
Can I get
Yes,